I'm Karen Hudes, and I'm the lawyer for the world's monetary gold reserves. They're in a trust called the Global Debt Facility, which is administered by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They were put in that trust at the end of World War II. As a matter of fact, the reason that Japan was bombed was because Japan refused to tell the bankers where the gold was. The gold had been put in the Philippines because Japan was afraid that they were going to be invaded, and it was hidden in the Philippines. But at one point, they shipped all the gold to Singapore, they melted it down, and they stamped it with the name of that trust fund, which is called TVM LSM 666, and those are the initials of Ferdinand Marcos's sons, because Ferdinand Marcos was the lawyer for the Global Debt Facility when he set it up. And as a matter of fact, when he was deposed, that was because he refused to give the gold in the world's monetary gold reserves back to the bankers. So they made sure that he ended his presidency in the Philippines by a staged EDSA revolution. But getting back to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, these organizations were set up specifically so that when the gold was taken out of secrecy, that there would be an organization that could decide what to do with that gold. And the reason that it was put into secrecy for 50 years is because of something that everybody knows about. It is that if you try to say you own something and you're not able to gain title to it after 50 years, there's a concept called the statute of limitations. That means you've lost your ownership. And the leaders at the time wanted to make sure that there was no argument, that there was a decision body that could decide what to do with the world's gold. And that organization has decided what to do with the gold. What they're planning on doing is minting currency for each of the members of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. There's 188 of them, and also there are some other countries that are not members of the World Bank and IMF, and they're also going to replace their paper currency with gold. And the reason why this is very important is because the paper currency is going to crash, and we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. We want to prevent the world from going into another dark ages. That's what happened to Rome. Their currency lost value. That's what happens when you don't have precious metals as a foundation for the currency. And one of the problems that we have is that there is something called the network of global corporate control. That's why we've called this series the network of global corporate control, because many people don't know that this network actually exists. It was studied by 3 mathematicians at the Federal Institute of Technology, and they published a paper in 2011. This group owns 40% of the assets of 43,000 transnational companies whose shares are traded on the capital markets. And if you have stock in the capital markets, you ought to know that there's nothing but insider trading. The Securities and Exchange Commission is just there for show. And one of the things that I discovered, because I've been working together with a network of whistleblowers, a lot of this information that I'm telling you, we've already made public on the internet. The internet is there to get your information from, because if you just depend on the mainstream media and even most of the alternative media, you're going to get the propaganda that the network of global corporate control wants you to believe. It's just propaganda. And one of the good things about the World Bank is that it's a knowledge bank. Many different companies that sell goods and services want to include them in the projects that are financed at the World Bank. And so in 2004, a political scientist named Jacek Kugler came to the World Bank, and told us about a power transition model, which is extremely accurate. He had produced this model for the Department of Defense, and it shows whenever there's a disagreement between the analysts and the model wins. You have to put information into the model, though, so it's only going to be as accurate as the information you provide. What information goes into the model? It's on a particular issue. You have to know who the groups are that influence that issue. You have to know where they stand on the problem. You have to know how powerful they are, and you have to guess how important that issue is to them. And so in 2004, as a lawyer inside the World Bank, I modeled rule of law at the World Bank. And that model predicted that if the United States did not play by the rules, we were going to lose in the United States something called the Gentleman's Agreement. That had been there for 66 years. It was that the United States could single-handedly just name the president of the World Bank, and the sister organization, the International Monetary Fund, right across the street, they were going to decide who was the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. And that left, that decision was taken in 2010 because the Treasury Department ignored my warning, and I could not get the World Bank into something called compliance. What is compliance? Compliance means that people who need to provide information to the decision makers are not punished when they tell the truth. And there was nothing but punishment at the World Bank. They had created something called the Institutional Integrity Department. That was nothing more than a goon squad that was going to fire an employee who tried to tell the truth. And accountants that were trying to correct inaccurate statements, accountants that were trying to show correct calculations of the interest payments on the loans, they were all fired. So when that happens, you have no internal controls. And so I went up the corporate ladder, which is what a lawyer is supposed to do when you have problems with internal controls. And when the audit committee didn't solve the problem, I went to the US Congress. And Senator Lugar wrote 3 letters to the World Bank asking them to correct the problem, held a number of hearings, and also ultimately commissioned a Government Accountability Office audit, which the World Bank refused to do. So this was a huge red flag for me, and the World Bank trades bonds on the capital markets, and it's necessary for the World Bank to be in compliance. It's also supervised by something called the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies. That group is chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. It has the Secretary of State on it. It has the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And the NAC simply ignored the problem. That's when I started to realize that I had an enormous problem on my hands. But I also had the power of that power transition model, which was telling me that the problem could be solved. It turned out that there was another model that Jacek Kugler had done, and that was for the world as a whole. And what that model showed was that Germany was a very important ally for the United States. If Germany wouldn't remain as the ally for the United States, it meant that we were going to go into World War III. And so when I went to the US Congress, I told them what Eckhard Deutscher had told me. He said that the World Bank board was treated like a mushroom, covered with fertilizer and kept in the dark. Now, Germany at this point is going to the BRICS. What are the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are no longer using the Federal Reserve notes as international reserve currency. That's because we have just a limited period of time to replace that paper currency, which is valueless. The only reason that currency has any value is if the citizens agree to pay interest on the debt. And the citizens are not going to be able to keep up with that for very good reason, because that currency is being devalued with all of the quantitative easing. Now, what is the Federal Reserve Board? that's a member of the network of global corporate control. And since I'm the lawyer for the Global Debt Facility, I know that when the Federal Reserve Board or the U.S. Treasury say that they have the United States monetary gold reserves, I know they're lying. So I did something called a notarial protest, which is I sent statements to the members of the World Bank, 188 ministers of finance. I sent statements to the Postmaster General of the United States, and that is a position that not very many people understand what that position is. Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General, and Benjamin Franklin was also the one who negotiated the Revolutionary War debt. He knew that that debt was going to come due in 1871, and when it came due, the bankers put the United States in bankruptcy, and they created a second secret constitution, which many more people know about now. That's when the District of Columbia was created. And they took that second secret constitution. What does it say? It says that the United States is a corporation. It says that the United States Congress are managers of that corporation. And it did something very terrible, which I found out because I sued the World Bank. When the World Bank fired me illegally, I bought a World Bank bond, and that meant that I could go to the courts, which I did. I also sued KPMG because the World Bank financial statements were out of compliance, and the ministers of finance on the board of the World Bank settled my lawsuit. And I thought I could go back inside the World Bank and just solve the problem. But the network of global corporate control has a security firm named Allied Barton, which provides the security services for the World Bank. And so I have fulfilled my duties outside the World Bank. That means that I have been writing to the ministers of finance. I've been writing to the members of Congress. That's when I found out that the members of Congress, instead of following their public duties, were acting like managers of a corporation. And we have to end this, it's called state capture, when the public servants are no longer doing their duties as public servants. But there are some other public servants who are not doing their duties. Those are the judges on the federal courts. And what I did a couple of days ago was I went to the insurance companies that are providing bonds for the faithful performance by the judges of their duties. And I told those insurance companies that I was going to be collecting on all of those bonds because the judges are forgetting to tell the American citizens that they're actually not in regular courts that they're entitled to under the Constitution. They're in secret administrative courts. How do I know this? That's because a fellow named George Mercier, who was the clerk of the New York court in 1985, wrote a book about hidden contracts. When you go into a bank and sign your bank signature card, there's a little provision in there that says subject to bank rules. And if you read the bank rules, it says that you have waived your right to a real court. This is a terrible state of affairs. And so as more and more people understand what the reality is, and it's not just people that have to understand what the reality, it's the lawyers, because the lawyers are reassuring everybody that things are just the way they're supposed to be, when in reality, we're not under our regular Constitution. The U.S. Congress has been declaring martial law. They've been declaring a state of emergency ever since 1861. And Abraham Lincoln was assassinated because he wanted to end this currency where you're paying interest to banks. Ronald Reagan did a study to see where our income taxes go. All of them leave the country and go to foreign bankers. First they go to the City of London, and then they're transferred to the Vatican. That's right, they're transferred to the Vatican. And many people, when they hear this information, are very shocked, and they want the proof. And I'm happy to tell you that I've been working with whistleblowers all over the world, and we have documented every single thing, every single statement I'm telling you, we have documentation in depth. And the reason that people are now understanding where we actually sit in this scenario is because we've been working together. And there is a ready solution in sight. We've been working on the solution. What is the solution? The solution is to take the gold monetary reserves and to mint that into currency that replaces the Federal Reserve note, because the Federal Reserve note is going to crash. Paper currencies always crash, and there are very ominous signs that people don't want the Federal Reserve notes anymore. They're no longer international reserve currencies. So I've written letters containing monetary agreements and sent them to all the ministers of finance. I've heard back from several of them. We want to make sure, though, that when these agreements are signed, that the gold will be delivered. And where is the gold? It is being guarded by the U.S. military in the Philippines primarily. It's also on deposit in some other banks around the world, but the bulk of the gold is in the Philippines. The U.S. military started guarding that gold after Typhoon Haiyan. And we have a situation with the U.S. military. There have been several close calls. What happened on October 7th in 2013 was that there was a live nuclear bomb which was flown across the country and landed in Charleston. And two military heroes rescued us. That was Vice Admiral Tim Giardina and Major General Mike Carey. What they did was they took that bomb and they detonated it off the coast of Charleston. And you can tell the proof is because there's seismograph records showing that there was a nuclear device detonated on the floor of the ocean, and also because military cables were intercepted. And there's other signs that the military is working to defend the citizens rather than to serve the interests of this network of global corporate control. But there are also some officials at the top who are working for Rome and not for the United States citizens. And this is a very difficult situation. Our Secretary of Defense, he was forced to resign. I had spoken to him when he was still Senator of Nebraska. That was in 2008. And we talked about the power transition model and how important it was that the United States preserve its own interest and not serve the interest of the network of global corporate control. And that situation played out then just a month ago because Heather Cole intercepted an order to detonate a first strike nuclear device against the Russians, and she refused. This is a very serious situation. That's why it's important that we end the state capture. What I have done is I have filed something called UCC financing statements. This is when a company is in debt to another company. You're allowed to show the evidence of that debt, and the Federal Reserve is in debt to the global debt facility. So I filed these UCC statements, and what I got in return was I got a letter from the Secretary of State of Illinois for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago challenging that financing statement. So what I did was I read the statute, and it said that if you are representing a bank that's regulated, that there can be no challenge. And so I wrote back to the Secretary of State of Illinois, and I said that since I represent a bank which is regulated, that's the World Bank, which is regulated by the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies, that I was exempt. But even so, I did provide the proof. And then I sent that letter around to all the ministers of finance, and I had them clear that letter. That was the first challenge. The second challenge I received was from the Secretary of State of Missouri, because the Federal Reserve Bank of the city of Kansas and also of St. Louis is in Missouri. So I received a bogus financing statement, which I had never filed. And I called up and I said, I'd like you to remove this. I never filed this. They misspelled the name of the Federal Reserve Bank. I've put all of this correspondence up on the internet. So I had a conversation with an employee in that office named Anne, who refused to give me her last name. And Anne accused me of being something called a sovereign citizen, which is put on the terrorist list. She asked me that question twice. I said, no, I'm not a sovereign citizen, and I resent very much that you're trying to trick me into identifying myself as a terrorist. And then I called and asked to speak to her supervisor. Her supervisor sent me a letter saying that I had to file a termination statement, rather than them admitting that they had just tried to trick me. So what I did was I took that correspondence and I circulated it on the internet, and I copied each and every Secretary of State. And then what I did was, I told you, I went to the insurance companies for all of the federal judges, and I told them that the global debt facility is collecting on those security bonds, because those judges they're impersonating real judges. And if this sounds outlandish, I discussed this with the American Bar Association, because they have been serving the interest of the network of global corporate control. And very fortunately, some of the lawyers are honest, good lawyers, and they are backing me. And they're backing the citizens of the United States, and we are going to have our currency. We have a U.S. Mint, we have a Mint Council, and the president of the Mint Council, Rhonda Sapp, is a member of the American Federation of Government Employees, and I've been in contact with that union. If that union is not going to allow us to mint the gold that belongs to the United States citizens, which was accepted by the county executives of America. It was accepted on behalf of the citizens. And the reason why it wasn't accepted by the governors or the states is because there's something called Metro 1313. The Network of Global Corporate Control has put up separate institutions to try to undo the states. They're trying to put us into FEMA regions. That's Federal Emergency Management Association agency. And we're not going there. They've tried to erase the boundaries of the states. We're not going there. We're sufficiently informed, and we are going to get our currency back, and we are going to have a smooth transition. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be briefing all of you in a series. I'll be speaking to you on Tuesday evenings between 6 and 6:30 for the next 3 months. And we are going to lick this problem together. That's in something called the global currency reset. I haven't talked about one of the most important aspects of that, and that is local currencies. We want all of the towns and villages to issue their own local currencies. And there are many ways to do this. Some of the villages have already done this. What that does is that creates immediately full employment. It gives an advantage to the local merchants and the goods and services, and it's going to, all of the countries are going to have towns and villages issuing local currencies, and we'll have the separate national currencies minted out of gold. This will be a whole different way of interacting. We're going to have, I don't know if you realize that many of the wars are what they call bankers' wars. We've been given false information. We've been set one against the other. And once we learn that this has happened, once we get to the root of where our problems are coming from, it should be relatively easy to go forward without world wars, without nuclear threats. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. And one of the emails that I got this morning, and by the way, I'd be very happy if you have any questions, if you would send me an email. That's KarenHudes@hotmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @KarenHudes. I try to answer all of my emails. And what I received this morning from someone who identified themselves as a very wealthy person who was very well connected with the United Nations. And we're going to have to come to terms in a peaceful transition. And I believe that this should be something that we can readily do. What I encourage people to do is to start your own networks, personal networks, and evaluate the information. Don't just sit back and wait for the news broadcasters to give you their version of what's happened, because you're going to be given propaganda and misled. And then when we have these groups, they can also help in making decisions as we go forward in a bright future. It's going to be a wonderful transition, I believe. But we have to learn how to inform each other. One of the concerns, there are different people watching this broadcast. Some of you have been paying attention to this issue and feeding me information and sharing information with a wide network. And some of you are just learning about this for the first time. And a lot of what you're hearing may sound preposterous. I can tell you that when I first heard this, it took me a long time of study. And yet, I believe that the global currency reset is going to be happening soon. And therefore, it's going to be important for you to rely on people to help you get caught up. But as I said, there are those people who have been studying this for many, many years. One of these people is Robert O'Bannon, and he wrote a book. I'll be happy to send that to you. It's a wonderful book. He was a Marine, and retired Marine, and did a lot of very careful analysis, and that's very helpful. I'd also be very happy to receive suggestions. I've been, as I said, working together with a group. Some people have questions about if this network of global corporate control were really that powerful. Would it be possible for an individual lawyer like you to continue to prevail? And the answer is yes, it is possible. It's possible because everybody is there and we're all working together as one. That's how this is taking place, and it's been very gratifying, actually, to be part of this this group that I call the Coalition for the Rule of Law. I'm being told that it's time to wrap up, so I look forward to your questions and your comments, and I look forward to speaking with you. It will be in 2 weeks. The following week, there'll be a tape which I've already produced with the wonderful group here at DCTV. And I want to thank the production crew. Good evening. To another episode of the Network of Global Corporate Control. Last week you learned about honest money. I'm your host, Karen Hudes, and I worked in the World Bank Legal Department for 20 years. The title, The Network of Global Corporate Control, comes from a study from 3 mathematicians at the Federal Institute of Technology. They discovered that there's a network of interlocking directors that controls 40% of the assets of the 43,000 companies traded on the world's capital markets, and at the very hub of that network is the central banks. If you have any questions about today's programming, please contact me at karenhudes@hotmail.com. And when people in the Washington, D.C. area wonder what this has to do with them, the biggest employer in Washington, D.C. is the World Bank. And the World Bank is at the very hub of this problem. It is sitting on the world's monetary gold reserves. And I'm not only the acting general counsel of the World Bank, I was reinstated by the 188 ministers of finance who are on the board of governors of the World Bank. The very first slide I wanted to show you is what has happened to the Federal Reserve Note. The Federal Reserve Note is not the same thing as the US dollar because the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's unconstitutional for the United States currency to be issued by a private bank. It's supposed to be issued by the US Congress. When John F. Kennedy wanted to do something about that, he accessed the gold that is at the very heart of the World Bank and the IMF. And he signed an agreement called the Green-Hilton Agreement. 8 days later, he was dead. Now you can see on the graph how much gold is in the Federal Reserve Note. It has declined in value. And right now, it's less than 1% of what it was in the very beginning if we had stayed with our constitutional currency. And gold is a very important commodity because gold has been used as currency through the ages. What happened when we went into the Dark Ages during the decline of the Roman Empire was they had watered down their currency. The amount of precious metals in their coins was being reduced. And at a certain point, people will no longer sell their gold for the currency. We're now in a situation called backwardation. We started being there in July of 2013. When you get into permanent gold backwardation, that means that you don't have any way to finance international trade except by barter. That leads to starvation and pestilence. And we don't want to go there. As a matter of fact, we are not going there. The chances that we replace the Federal Reserve Note before it crashes, it's now toxic, as you can see on the graph. The chance that we replace the Federal Reserve Note for gold that's coming to the United States out of a trust fund that is managed by the World Bank and the IMF, the chance is 95%. I know that for a fact because of a power transition model that came from the Department of Defense to the World Bank in 2003. And I've been working on that problem together with other whistleblowers at the World Bank and outside the World Bank. And now we're not just working with whistleblowers. We're working in a coalition of countries. That's the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's the Group of 77, which is 133 developing countries. That's Germany. And that's the United States minus the Federal Reserve, which is unconstitutional. And when you think some of the things that I'm telling you might sound a little bit unexpected, that's because there are facts that we are simply not focusing on. And one of the facts that I wanted to show you is a 500-year-old map. It's called the Piri Reis map, and it shows the coastline of Antarctica, which you couldn't see because that's buried under ice. The last time that coastline was out there was about 13,000 years ago. How could somebody chart accurately the landmass under that frozen ice in Antarctica? That's a very good question. And when you try to answer that question, you come up with a lot of other questions, such as whether the history that we know is really accurate. Why is it that we can't explain all of the ancient civilizations that are buried on the coastlines? Because the level of the oceans has risen by 400 feet. And so look at the map and ask yourself whether the facts that you know as facts are really facts. One of the facts that people talk about is how small the amount is of gold, because we're looking at a very short timeline. We're looking at 5,000 years of mining gold. What if the amount of time that we mined gold stretched back to 13,000 years? There'd be a lot more gold. And as a matter of fact, there is a lot more gold, because I'm also the lawyer of something called the Global Debt Facility, which has over 1 million metric tons of gold in it. And that amount of gold is going to be issued to replace the paper currencies. Paper currencies always crash, and we are not going to sit around and wait for our paper currencies to crash. I've been discussing this, and I've been corresponding with the ministers of finance who are on the board of governors of the World Bank, and actually 3 countries have written back to tell me that yes, they're interested. And one of the things that we're going to be doing in very short order is we are going to be minting the gold that's coming to the United States, and we're going to be replacing the Federal Reserve notes with honest currency. And when you do that, you don't have to pay interest on your country debt. As a matter of fact, we're not going to have country debt. None of the countries are going to have country debt, because it turns out that the network of global corporate control owes us much more money than we owe them. They issued bonds in the 1930s, and those bonds have been accruing interest. It was over $200 trillion worth of bonds when they were issued. They were issued by Yamashita when he was gathering up the gold from the elites, and we're going to hear a lot more about the elites during this program. When he issued those bonds, the elite relinquished their gold. They were afraid that the gold was going to be taken from them during the World War, and it wasn't taken from them. It's now in the Global Debt Facility. One of the things that happened in the spring, on the 17th and 19th of April, was the spring meeting of the World Bank and the IMF. Now, I wanted to go into that meeting. I was supposed to go into that meeting. What kept me out of that meeting? 2 things. One of them was the security guards, Allied Barton, which is a company that's owned by the network of global corporate control. And the other thing that kept me out, that was the DC police. Now, I had spoken to Commander Michael Maurice about this, because it turns out that the District of Columbia is a very special place. There's a second secret constitution in the United States that was given to us. It was given to us in 1871 by the Network of Global Corporate Control. And the District of Columbia is a place which is out of step with the rest of the United States. because in that second secret constitution, they turned the United States into a company. This sounds, the first time I heard it, I couldn't believe it either. If anybody wants to see proof of this, I will show you these paperwork from a study group in South Carolina where they went and looked at their state house records to see whether this could have possibly happened to the United States. Yes, it did. We're now under something called state capture. Things are not the way they appear to be. The U.S. Congress is actually not, the people in the U.S. Congress, the representatives, they are actually managers of this corporation. And one of the things that happened at the end of the spring meetings was we declared this network of global corporate control to be insolvent and in receivership. That's because the $210 trillion worth of bonds that were issued in order to gather up the gold, and they're now worth $2 quadrillion. We told the network of global corporate control that they were insolvent and that they were in receivership. So in actual fact, Commander Michael Reese, who's no longer the commander of the 2nd Precinct, he was replaced by Melvin Gresham. He was replaced right after I complained about him to the Board of Ethics and Government. Well, what happened was Melvin Gresham thought it was his business to prevent me from going into the World Bank meetings. That was a mistake on his part. So I went to the board and I complained about Commander Michael Reese on April 2nd. And when Melvin Gresham did the same exact corrupt thing, that's when I went back to that meeting. This is a corrupt business environment. The World Bank is not going to stay as in Washington, D.C. if their general counsel is prevented from going to work by the District of Columbia police force. Now, one of the things that happened following the spring meetings of the World Bank and following the insolvency of the network of global corporate control was that I tweeted about the general counsel of the DC Council, Dave Zvenyach. On May 9th, I tweeted that. I said that I will be sure to let the DC government's main employer, the World Bank, know that your office has no stake in providing a favorable business climate and rule of law. The following week, he was replaced by Ellen Efros. So I went to the meeting of the Board of Ethics and Governance. What did they do? They refused to hear me. They didn't follow their agenda. This is a corrupt business environment when that happens. Now, what is the network of global corporate control doing when all of this is going on? It's very interesting. They've been declared bankrupt. They've been put into insolvency. And so what have they been doing? They went to the International Court of Justice and they issued a statement saying that all of the paperwork of the global debt facility, this paperwork was actually done by Ferdinand Marcos, because most of the gold in the global debt facility is in the Philippines. So the International Court of Justice issued a statement saying that they were no longer going to accept any of the paperwork. It was no longer valid. So I went back to that court and I told them that, first of all, they had no jurisdiction. I said that the gold had been in sequestration. That means that for 50 years, nobody knew anything about the gold. And that was by express agreement. The elite and the bankers all signed an agreement in 1950 called the Bilateral Minesfield Breakthrough Successor Agreement, when they put the world's gold in trust. And that's when they said that it would be the World Bank and the IMF Board of Governors that would decide what to do with the gold. Well, the CIA then followed what happened in the International Court of Justice. I said, since the ICJ had no jurisdiction, they had no right to say anything about the paperwork or whether Ferdinand Marcos documentation remains valid. Of course it remains valid. So what happened after that? It's like a game of ping pong. Then somebody invited the Board of Governors to go to the Philippines. And they were issuing that invitation on behalf of a son of Ferdinand Marcos, and also on behalf of something called the Committee of 300. Now, that Committee of 300, if anybody wants to look them up, who are they? They're the royalty. They were the ones that gave up their gold for those certificates that are now worth over $2 quadrillion. That's right, quadrillion dollars. Now, since this debt is owed to the global debt facility, I filed financing statements with the states where the Federal Reserve banks are located. And I made those statements stick. Two of the secretaries of state challenged those financing statements. One of them was the Secretary of State of Illinois. And he said that he was going to, he wanted to see proof. So I cleared the letter that I sent to him with all of the ministers of finance. And then I put that out on the internet so people could see it. And he didn't react. And then I sent all that paperwork to all of the secretaries of state so that all of them would know that we are now in a different kind of a situation. We're in a situation where the Federal Reserve Bank is insolvent and where we're going to be replacing Federal Reserve notes before they crash. And 5 days after that, what happened? That's when the Secretary of State sent me a letter, which made absolutely no sense. I don't want to get into technical issues, but the statute didn't apply because the World Bank is a bank that's regulated. It's regulated by something called the National Advisory Council. That's chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. It's got the chairman of the Federal Reserve on that. It's got the all of the economic agencies are represented. The Secretary of Commerce is on there. The Secretary of State is on the National Advisory Council. And I said, since the World Bank was regulated in the United States, that the Secretary of State of Illinois could not challenge the financing statement that was filed against the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So I sent him back a letter saying that he had no right. He was acting without authority. He couldn't invalidate that financing statement. One of the other secretaries of state also tried challenging. He just he made up something. He said that I had filed a financing statement against the Federal Reserve Bank of State Missouri, which doesn't exist. And then when I called up his office, somebody said that I was obviously a sovereign citizen. And anybody who claims to be a sovereign citizen is put on a terrorist list. I said, no, they had no right to put me on a terrorist list. They were just clutching at straws. So what's actually happened is by trying to challenge the law and the coalition for the rule of law, they have exposed themselves for being corrupt. And the thing about the courts, the federal courts, is they're not real courts. The people who are acting as federal judges are simply impersonating federal judges. What they're doing is they are looking at when somebody signs their name on a bank signature card, there's fine print underneath it that says that it's subject to bank rules. And if you look to see what the bank rules are, there's a hidden secret contract that says you waive your right to constitutional courts. And the reason that we know this is because the chief clerk in New York wrote about this on the internet. He wrote a book. And so I went to the courts and I asked them to admit that they were not acting like real judges. And they refused to admit this. So I went to a meeting of the Surety and Fidelity Association of America, because when a judge steps up to his court, he has an oath of office, and all of these judges are betraying their oaths of office. And so I can collect on all of the surety bonds. And I've called up all of the major insurance companies to tell them that the global debt facility is going to be, doesn't want to be collecting on their surety bonds for these corrupt judges. What we want is we want to have real judges. We want to have this second secret constitution in the District of Columbia erased. And how do we do that? That's not so difficult, actually, because the people that wrote the Constitution realized that we had bankers that were trying to corrupt our government. And so they wrote something called Article 5, which says that when 2/3 of the state legislatures ask for a convention to consider amendments, that the Congress is required to give us a convention. And that's where we are right now. Now, there are two studies, recent studies, that I wanted to tell you about to give you some food for thought, because I'm sure I've been giving you a lot of information that may come as a surprise to you. And I want you, if you're interested, to look at some of the other information that's available. One is a study by Valentin Katasanov, which deals with new documents that have just come to light that confirm the organization of the Second World War by United States and UK bankers, covered by Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, in the hope of destroying the USSR. World War II was not unleashed by a Führer who happened to be ruling Germany. World War II is a project that was created by world oligarchy, or Anglo-American money owners, using instruments like the U.S. Federal Reserve System and the Bank of England, which is a private bank. They started to prepare for the next world conflict of global scale right after World War I. USSR was the target. And there's another study that was recently concluded that also gives you food for thought. Professors Martin Gillens at Princeton University and Benjamin I. Page of Northwestern University looked at more than 20 years' worth of data to answer a simple question: does the government represent the people? Their study took data from nearly 2,000 public opinion surveys and compared it to the policies that ended up becoming law. In other words, they compared what the public wanted to what the government actually did. What they found was very unsettling. The opinions of 90% of Americans has essentially no impact at all. Gillens and Page found that the number of Americans for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. And I'm quoting from the study. The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. What does have influence? Money. While the opinions of the bottom 90% of income earners in America have a statistically non-significant impact, economic elites, business interests, and people who can afford lobbyists still carry major influence. Nearly every issue we face as a nation is caught in the grip of corruption. Now, we're going to be following up on these troubling issues in the coming weeks. This series is going to be going on for another 9 weeks. On the odd week, I'm going to be live. So next week, we're going to have a pre-taped program for you. And I hope that you'll get in touch with me and let me know whether there are questions that you have. I would expect that these troubling things I've been mentioning to you would raise a lot of questions. One of the reasons that they're coming to you as a surprise is because this network of global corporate control that I've been telling you about owns all of the media. And whatever you're learning on your news is because they want you to be frightened. They want you to think that there's nothing you can do to influence things. If the Congress is not going to be interested in what the public wants, why would anyone else? Well, the reason that you don't have to feel upset about this is because of the network that we have. Our network for the rule of law is much stronger, actually, than this corrupt network. Because when people learn about this corruption and they tell everyone else about it, it can't exist. It can only exist in secrecy, and it's not secret anymore. We don't have to worry about their mainstream media. We can go to public access TV. We can go to the internet. We can go to the social media. And that's exactly where we're going, and that's exactly what we're doing. There should be some reactions to these disclosures. In the meantime, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be minting the currency that's constitutional. We're going to be replacing the Federal Reserve notes. I've been in touch with the American Federation of Government Employees to see whether the U.S. Mint is going to be minting the gold that belongs to the United States, or whether we have to contract with a private mint. Denmark has actually contracted for their currency to be minted from a private company. I would hope that people will get in touch with the American Federation of Government Employees, because one of their employees, Rhonda Sapp, is a member of the AFGE. I would think it would be a good thing for the U.S. Mint to be minting constitutional gold. And the way we're going to do it, it's not just going to be coins. There's a way of pressing gold very thin and putting it between a plastic envelope in something called aurum. So you can have bills that look just like paper bills, but they actually have the amount of gold in them that's on the face amount of the bill. Now, I wanted to thank you very much for watching the network of global corporate control. The next episode that you'll see next week will feature state capture. State capture means that the public officials are not doing what they're supposed to according to their public office. They're doing what the network of global corporate control wants them to do. Well, we're going to watch them very closely to see that state capture is going to melt like the snow in springtime. And I would expect that there'll be a fair amount of pushback by this network of global corporate control. But as I mentioned, this power transition model, which is 90 to 95% accurate, has been predicting that the people will be the ones to overpower the network of global corporate control. And that's exactly what we're intending to do. Until next time, I'm your host, Karen Hudes, and I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank the wonderful people here at DCTV who have been doing a marvelous job bringing you the network of global corporate control. Until next time, I'm your host, Karen Hudes.